Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is Patrick Webb. I'm the worship associate for today. Whoever you are and whomever you love, wherever you are at this moment and wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome to this place of memory and hope, where we share our joys and our struggles in our quest for what is good and true. Welcome to the service for today, April 24th, 2022, and today I am pleased to introduce our guest, James Carroll, to speak to us today. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interdependence of all life. Come together to learn from each other, and we draw inspiration from many sources to work together to build communities of greater justice and compassion. If this is your first time visiting us here today, I extend a special welcome and invite you to speak with our greeters or pick up a welcome packet at the front. Please rise in body and spirit and join us in our hymn. Please remain standing and join us in our affirmation. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve life in fellowship, to the end that all souls grow in harmony. Thus do we covenant with each and with all. Please be seated. No candles have been lit today, or no messages have been lit today, but candles have been lit.
For all our joys, all our sorrows spoken aloud or held in the silence of our hearts, let us gather together now in a spirit of prayer and reflection. Eternal and beloved, gracious source of all life and all love. At this time, we pray for peace, and that the spirit of peace will enter into the hearts of the world and our world leaders, that we can find a way to live together despite our differences in harmony and love. All this we pray in the names of those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten, in the names of all the helpers of mankind. Amen. Let us be together in silence. Oh, here it is. They moved it on me. I apologize. Let's try that again. Now let us be together in silence. The world is just the world, unfolding according to the patterns of nature, free of any judgmental attributes. The world exists. Beauty and goodness are things we bring to it. Sean Carroll, The Big Picture. I wouldn't persuade you from whatever you believe or whatever you don't. That's your business. But I thought of the wrens singing. What could it be if it isn't a prayer? So I just listened, my pen in the air. Mary Oliver. Ask a cloud, what is the date of your birth? Before you were born, what were you? Before being born, it was the water on the ocean's surface, or it was in the river. The cloud does not come from nothing. There has been only a change in form. It is not a birth or something out of nothing. Sooner or later, the cloud will change into rain or snow or ice. If you look deeply into the rain, you can see the cloud. The cloud is not lost. It is transformed. Thich Nhat Hanh. No death, no fear.
And I would invite any young or young at heart to come up here for a time for all ages. Anyone want to come? Awesome, y'all are great. Yeah, you can sit here if you want. So, how many of you like to ask questions? Raise your hand. Yeah? Oh, lots of, yep. I feel you are really good at asking questions. So maybe you have questions like why some people have green eyes and some people have brown eyes. Maybe you have questions like, why do giraffes look like they do? Or questions like, how did that fire in the Jemez start? Or how can we create a peaceful world together? Or when will we create warp speed so we can travel to other galaxies? Yep. Sometimes we have lots of questions about things around us or in our life. And there are numerous ways that we can explore the questions that we have. We can explore these questions through science, math, music, art, talking, meditation, writing, religion, and numerous other ways. One creative outlet some people use to explore their questions is through writing poetry. How many of you have heard a poem before? Raise your hand. Yeah? Oh, I know. Yeah. We just heard one. Or maybe even written a poem. How many of you? Yeah, exactly. So one poem that we learn as kids is, you guys can help repeat this with me. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. And I end it there. It goes on, right? So the person who wrote this poem also was turned into a song, right? Because we sing it, was asking a question about the stars in the sky. So here's another poem that I wrote with one of my questions. Why is the sky blue? And why do the clouds do what they do? Up there in the sky, passing by, maybe the blue hue comes from my magic stew or the zoo. Or maybe I should ask a scientist why the sky's hue is blue. And sometimes I like to write funny poems. Roses are red, violets are blue. I want tacos and queso too. Or sometimes I like to write a haiku. Haven't many of you written haikus before? Ooh, yeah. I like to haiku. My haiku to you use. Love beyond belief. There we go. So there are lots of different types of poems and different ways you can write them. We have lots of folks in our church who write poetry too. Some of you raised your hand. Kelly DeLessie's not here. She writes poems. Chuck Forrest was one of our members who wrote lots of poems. And here is one of his poems that I wanted to share with y'all that he sent me in an email once, called Be Still and Listen by Charles A. Forrest. Be still, be here, and listen. Listen to the sounds of the earth, of life, not only forte sounds, but especially those pianissimo sounds, quiet sounds, barely audible, spoken words, perhaps, but no one is there, yet it seems to be speaking. Ears search for words, sentences, or quiet sighs, sighs of love, sighs of solitude, or is it memory speaking? Listen again, not only with ears. Be still, be here. Listen as all creation listens. So today, for our intention table activity and to celebrate National Poetry Month, which is this month, which I just found out yesterday when I was writing this, we are going to write poetry and or draw a picture of a question you might have. So you are welcome to go to the intention table and get a worksheet and start simply if you want, or you can use the back and write some other poems throughout your week as you reflect. Thanks for coming up, guys.
I'm going to bring my phone up here for my notes. Thank you all for coming. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. The terrible questions. They're called terrible because ostensibly they're incredibly difficult to answer, if not impossible, and yet without them, we feel left adrift, not sure what life is about or what it is for. Questions like, who are we? What are we? Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? What's the purpose of life? What kind of life should I live? These are the questions of philosophy the philosophers have wrestled with for ages and ages and come to no certain conclusion. Nevertheless, it appears that one of the purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Church, or at least one of its principles, is to try to help us answer the questions that can't be answered. The privilege calls us not to be isolated and self-centered, believing that our single perspective trumps all others, but rather to be humble, to be open to the great mysteries of truth and meaning that life offers, and those mysteries may speak to us through our own intuition and experiences, but also through tradition, community, conflict, nature, and relationships. There's a lot of ways to answer them, is what he's saying, right? And we shouldn't think we have the only answer. As a faith tradition, Unitarian Universalism makes sacred the right and responsibility to engage in the free and responsible quest as an act of religious devotion. Institutionally, we have left open the questions of what truth and meaning are, acknowledging that mindful people will, in every age, discover new insights. Essentially, we just told us that the church doesn't have an answer to these questions, and yet seeking answers is our purpose, which makes it questionable whether I should try to present answers since the church has none. I think which is why I subtitled this, my arrogant attempt to answer the meaning of life. I think my goal today is to present to you an option in the hope that it may serve you in building your own sense of purpose and meaning. And I encourage you to throw away the parts for you that don't work and grab the parts that do and build your own version of this, whatever that might look like. As Richard Feynman, a scientist who worked at Los Alamos Laboratories, once said, I would rather have questions that cannot be answered rather than answers that cannot be questioned. So I'm going to build today my synthesis from three sources: poetry, science, and religion. Specifically the poetry of Mary Oliver, and I'm going to use this book by Carroll, which I encourage everyone to go read. It was a wonderful read called The Big Picture. And also some readings from Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk who lived in a time of war and strife and suffering, much like we're in today, and showed great courage as he found ways to work through that strife with loving kindness. The answers to these questions and the lack thereof often creates what we call an existential crisis, and often that crisis is intensified when we are faced with the death of a loved one, or with our own mortality. It's as we face mortality. I apologize for this, Mike. I'm going to do some things out of order, if you don't mind jumping ahead to here. For the Buddha, and then I'll go back. I know you're trying to keep up with my slides. For the Buddha, his existential crisis came when he was faced with suffering, death, and he first left the palace, according to the myth, and he first saw a suffering person, a sick person, a poor person, and a dead person. And it led to an existential crisis. And I draw hope from this because it shows that existential crises don't always lead to suffering. Sometimes they lead to great enlightenment. For Carroll, it came when he was almost in a car accident that almost killed him. He barely survived, and this led him to be much more interested in science. And in just trying to discover scientific answers to the great questions of why we live. Mary Oliver grew up in an abusive home, and she also suffered late in life from cancer. And many of her poems grew out of her experience with cancer. For example, she said, this is one of her poems titled The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac, which, as we all know, is cancer. The question is, what will it be like after the last day? Will I float into the sky, or will I fray within the earth or a river, remembering nothing? How desperate I would be if I couldn't remember the sun rising, if I couldn't remember trees, rivers, if I couldn't even remember, beloved, your beloved name. I'm skipping back here. My own existential crisis grew out of the death of my mother. But first, let's talk about the certainty I had before my crisis began. Hugh Nibley, the famous Mormon apologist, liked to say that without answers to the terrible questions, life has no meaning, and the glory and purpose of God and religion is to give us answers rather than to guide us in finding our own answers. It's to provide rote answers to these questions. And my favorite thing about being a Mormon was that I thought I knew all the answers to the world's hardest problems and questions, people that great philosophers had struggled with for generations. I knew the answers to them all. I wish they just, became Mormon and knew too. For example, I knew where we came from, that we lived in this premortal life, why we were here on this earth, the entire purpose of life on earth, where we were going when we die, and I had a great, diagram of the entire, path my soul would take. My favorite book of scripture was Moses chapter 1. Moses chapter 1 is a story of biblical fan fiction written by Joseph Smith that takes place somewhere between the time when Moses had the burning bush and before he went down into Egypt. And it's basically God trying to buoy him up before he sends him to Egypt. And so the story goes, God came to Moses and showed him the world. And Moses wondered at the size of the world, and he felt totally insignificant compared to the size of the world, an experience Carroll will also have. Just that sense of wonder at the world, something that was just beginning to be understood, the true grandeur and size of the universe when Joseph Smith lived in the 1800s. It was just beginning to be understood. It's much bigger now than we thought, and we are much more insignificant now than even Joseph knew. But Moses has showed all these things, and he wonders and says, isn't this amazing? For this purpose I knew, for this cause, he says, I know that man is nothing, which thing I had never before supposed. Great humility, you see, compared to God's glory, because God is the creator of all this. Then God comes down and shows him worlds without number, not just this world have I created. And then he says, after Moses' moment of humility, he says this, God says, this is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. In other words, God's purpose and the reason he made all this is to make us like him. This is a machine for making gods. And it was brilliant and it was beautiful and I loved it. And the entire purpose of the world was to make me like God. And God made it all to make that happen. I was nothing compared to God's greatness and glory, and yet the entire purpose of life and God's purpose was to make me better, to make me be happy. Now, but why would I want to be like, maybe it sounds obvious to you why you would want to be like God. Maybe that's intrinsic already. But you could ask the question, why? You notice that every answer to the terrible questions has a meta answer. You can always ask why to whatever answer someone gives and just push it further down. But Mormonism does go one level deeper. The reason we want to be like God is because God exists in a state of joy, and by becoming like God, we have a state of joy, and we have the ability to give that to others. So God says to Moses, not only is my work and glory to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man, I have a work for you to do, Moses, to go into Egypt, for you are a son of God, a child who can be like me, and your job is to go into Egypt and meet a man named Ramses, which means the son of God, the son of Ra-mesis, the son of God, and your name is Moses, the son of nobody. But you, Moses, are actually the son of God, and I'm going to send you to Egypt to help me bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. So not only does God have a purpose, I have a purpose, to participate in this great work of making others like God. And I reveled in the certainty that I had all the answers, and I wanted to convince everyone else too. So I would go on a mission for the Mormon Church and knock on people's doors and say, how would you like to know the meaning of life? And they would slam the door in my face. And it was a very exciting 2 years. I still remember the moment I was sitting on the shores of this lake, reading a commentary on the Bible of all things, and everything fell apart. Everything. I lost everything because in a blinding flash, I realized this made no sense. And it wasn't the answers that made no sense. It was some of the stories. For example, if you've been to my Bible classes before COVID that I used to give and that I hope to do again someday, you'll know why the biblical fan fiction of the story of Moses can't be true. The way that it goes, by the way, is that after this experience I just related, God starts to dictate Genesis chapter 1, the creation of the world. Right? So this is all dictation to Moses. We know that's not where Genesis came from. And as I was reading about that, I realized this just made no sense. And it was interesting that my favorite chapter, that story of Moses, played such an important role in kind of the moment it all fell apart. Because I realized it just was not possible. But it wasn't the answers that weren't possible. It was the story told around those answers. And I struggled. Do I keep the answers? Do I give out the stories? How much of this do I still believe? Which parts of this are still true? Which parts of this aren't? And it all fell apart. And I could think of nothing else for 3 years. Worse, I didn't dare tell anyone that I didn't believe this stuff for 3 years. And so I was alone. The year after this happened, my mother passed away. And I remember in Mormon funerals, you give, the funeral is all about, you get people into the church for the first time, in years sometimes, who've never been, so they all come in for funerals. So you're supposed to use that moment to try to convert people, to bring them back, because you have to have the right answer to these questions to be saved. This is the difference between a universalist and someone who believes that you have to have specific answers to these questions for your own salvation. And I stood up and I gave the sermon at my mother's funeral, and I talked about the plan of salvation and the meaning of life in Moses chapter 1 and the purpose of it all, and I believed none of it. And it hurt. Because I knew I didn't know what I did believe, and I didn't know if I was ever going to see my mother again, and I was crushed, and I couldn't tell anyone how I really felt. I'm skipping ahead again. That's the moment when you first look down. Wile E. Coyote, notice, is quite capable of standing in the air on nothing until he looks down. That moment of looking down is called an existential crisis, because I don't know who I am, where I came from, why I'm here, or what existence itself is all about. I was a scientist as well. So those of you who don't know me, I'm a computer. My PhD is in computer science, but I spend all day with physicists. As a computer scientist, I studied statistical machine learning. So it was all about how do you know what is true, so that computers can do it too, if they can figure out what's true, what's not. So I studied epistemology, the way you discover what truth is. And I taught comparative religion. So here's this person who teaches in the religion department at BYU to pay his way through school, and who also studies how you know what is true and what isn't. And so as I started to work through what we knew from science, so that means I'm going to be combining ideas from religion, right, and science, and things in my own answers to these questions. As I work through my answers, naturalism was a place you could go, right? And naturalism is usually expressed as this idea that there is no God and it's just the natural world. I want to be clear. My purpose in today's sermon isn't to convince you that there is no God. It's to provide a potential answer for where meaning comes from if you believe in God. Meaning can still come from this. If you don't believe in God, meaning can still come from this. And so I'm going to talk about naturalism not just in this concept that there is no God, but in this concept of there is a natural world. Whether it's the only world or not is up to you, but there is a natural world, and the natural world evolves according to some unbroken patterns. Those are the laws of nature, and that's what science is all about, discovering those laws of nature. And the only reliable way of learning those is by observing them. You use your eyes, you look, and you see what the answers are. This is the search for truth. But you'll notice meaning is nowhere to be found. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But if naturalism says, as we begin to observe the world, the first thing we learned is that the world is made up of a bunch of particles that move around. And that's it. Like everything else vanishes and can be explained in terms of this reductive thing where we go back to these particles that move around and interact with each other. And that makes everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever touched, talked to, seen, been with, people, animals, this chair, everything is just moving particles in a field. And quantum mechanics makes it a little more complicated, but this idea still works. And I'm going to leave that behind because most people who apply to quantum mechanics do so to provide some sort of woo-hoo to find a way out of this. And in truth, it doesn't work. And we can talk about that offline if you'd like. But quantum, I'm just going to talk about moving particles in a field, and it turns out, even if you had quantum mechanics, you're back in the same space. Where in those moving fields is love? Where is meaning? Where is purpose? In fact, David Hume, the philosopher, famously said there is no ought in is. Ought specifically meaning what we ought to do cannot be found anywhere in what is. What is just a bunch of moving particles and the laws that tell you how they evolve into the future and back into the past. That's it. Which means that a world of war, suffering, death, genocide is one organization of atoms. A world of love, joy, light, and peace is another. And there is no external reason to prefer one over the other. And one possible conclusion to all this is that there is no answer. Life is meaningless. Life is purposeless. And you can sink down into despair, which is kind of where I was headed. A similar observation led the Buddha, though, to notice that the self is what he would call an illusion, meaning the self doesn't exist. I don't exist. I'm just a bunch of atoms. You don't exist. You're just a bunch of atoms. You notice? Same sort of idea. What we need here, and what the Buddha needed, and what we need, and what we all need, is a jetpack. Some way to fly instead of falling once we look down into the abyss of naturalism. And of course, is naturalism really an abyss? Like I said, I'm going to use several different approaches, but the key to the core idea, and one that we will find in Buddhism, and we will find it in science, and we find it in poetry, is this idea of poetic naturalism, thus my reference to poetry. And this is the position that Sean Carroll puts forth as an option in The Big Picture. And this is not a science class, I apologize, but we're going to talk about Boyle's law. If you don't like science and you don't want to hear this, you can ignore this part and you'll be okay. But Boyle's law is just a fancy way of writing some squiggles on the board, that equation, that tell you how pressure and volume interact. If I squish a bunch of air together, it pushes back pressure. And pressure is proportional to the volume. Pressure times volume equals this constant. And you can prove that with several different experiments that we've done. What I want to point out here for just a minute is at the deepest level, Boyle's law is not true. Not only is it not true, it's not anywhere in the equations of motion of those atoms. You don't find Boyle's law as one of the fundamental elements of nature. It's an emergent property of more fundamental laws. Fundamental laws are just the movement of these atoms. But Boyle's law explains in broad pictures what happens to a lot of these atoms when you get a lot of them together on average. As you push them together, they bounce around a lot more and they push back, tend to. But at any given moment, Boyle's law doesn't hold. Boyle's law is a statement of averages. So truth, according to, this was the definition of truth given in Mormonism, and I haven't found a better one, so I'm going to stick with it. Truth is a knowledge of things as they are, as they were, and as they are to come. What's interesting about that definition is if I were to list the position of all the atoms and their movements and everything, there is no knowledge in that. It's rote memorization. There's no use. I can't do anything with it. Knowledge comes when we take these laws that you would otherwise have to memorize, and we make general principles that hold kind of on average that compress the idea. If you've ever used a JPEG, it's a way of compressing an image. It's sort of lossy compression. In other words, it's a way of summarizing. It does not memorizing every particle. We summarize general principles from them, and we end up with Boyle's law. Boyle's law is an emergent property that comes out of these individual motions of particles. Why does that matter? Because You can say the same thing about other stuff, like waves. In Buddhism, we talk about what's called the two truths. There's absolute truth, which you can think of as the moving of the molecules, and then there's relative truth. You can think about that as a term like a wave, or like a self, or like James, or Heidi, or my mother. Those are all relative truths. They're not found anywhere in the movement of the atoms, but they're emergent properties and then stories we tell about the emergent properties that help us make sense of the world. By separating the world into this and that, into this object and that object, and you and me, we can tell stories about the world that help us make sense of it. And they're no less real. Poetic naturalism is the idea that the stories we tell are no less real than the fundamental nature of reality. They're just a story. We see them as a story, and we see them as important, and we see their value, and it's okay to have those stories and tell those stories. And now we can start talking about things like beauty and meaning and truth from inside a conscious creature that is itself a collection of atoms, but that has emerged out of that a consciousness that does care whether we live in a world of suffering or whether we live in a world of light and beauty. And that emergent property allows us to have this sense of truth and meaning. So, poetic naturalism proposes that there are many ways of talking about the world. There's the base level, and there's these other levels. All of the good ways of talking must be consistent with one another, just like Boyle's law is consistent with the quantum mechanics of the moving atoms. They have to be consistent with one another and with the world. And our purposes in the moment determine the best ways of talking about things. So if someone comes to me and says, should I go to school or should I drop out and get a job? And I said, well, quantum mechanics says that atoms move around according to this equation. It wouldn't help them answer the question. But there's a story we tell about school and people, and if I talk at that level, I can help them answer the question. And so the proper level depends on what the purpose I'm engaging with at the time. There are three levels of these stories. There's the deepest fundamental level, that's the quantum mechanics. There's the emergent affective descriptions, and there's this world of values, right and wrong. The values come out of our own preferences. They come from looking at the world from inside a mind rather than from outside. So if there is no ought from is, as David Hume said, there is an ought inside of me. As this collection of atoms has a preference built by evolution or wherever it came from, it doesn't matter. I have one, and given that I have one, there is a right and a wrong, a good and a bad world, a better way to talk. Notice this is not quite the same as relativism. Right? Relativism says each culture has their own answers to what's right and wrong, and you can't critique each other. And this says, no, there are answers to these questions. But the answers come from inside us. They're not externally objective in that sense. So in this world of you, what am I? Well, I'm a collection of these atoms. What does that mean? One way to think about the nature of self, and by the way, the reason I'm going to, there's a lot of these existential questions we could ask, like, is there a God? What's the purpose of life? I'm going to focus on what am I and what is the self. And the reason I am is because you'll notice in both Sean Carroll, the Buddha, and Mary Oliver, all of them found solace in their existential crisis or through their existential crisis by focusing on the nature of the self. So I'm going to do that too for just a minute. I want to talk about the nature of the self. On the left here is a picture of me preparing for a religion class at BYU while I still believed in the Mormon church. On the right is a picture of me but 2 years ago, just before COVID, as I came here to sing a song about Crazy Train for one of the sermons here. And the question I'm asking is, are those the same people? And at some level, obviously, I think they're not. So you see, who I was had to die for who I am now to be born. And this is why, among other things, talking about the self helps us think about death. What does it mean to die? Well, it depends. What am I to begin with? So I'm a collection of atoms. I'm also a changing being, and as such, the I at any moment is never the same. There's a famous thought experiment called the Ship of Theseus. Theseus is this famous person who helped to found Athens. And the idea is they wanted to preserve the Ship of Theseus for all time so that people could come and see the famous Ship of Theseus. The problem is, as it sat in the port, it eventually, wore down. Planks would rot out and things, and they'd replace it one plank at a time. And the question arises, at what point does it stop being the Ship of Theseus? After I replace one plank, is it still the Ship of Theseus? It feels like it is, one plank. How about if I replace 2? How about if I replace 5? How about if I replace all of it? And how about if I take all the planks that I replaced it with and build a new Ship of Theseus out of the old ones? Now which one is the Ship of Theseus? The point of this thought experiment is to show that the self and identity of anything, an object or ourself, is a constructed concept. It's not an objective reality. It's a construct we construct. What's the answer to the ship? I don't know. You decide. Because the Ship of Theseus doesn't exist. Atoms exist. What you call the Ship of Theseus is an emergent property that you get to define. It's a definitional question. The same is true of what is me, what is you, who am I, what am I. These are all emergent properties and definitional. All right. Another famous thought experiment, very similar to the Ship of Theseus, is the idea of the transporter. And this is a thought experiment where you create a machine that can move people from one place to another by scanning the atoms of one, reconstructing them in the same orientation somewhere else, and then destroying the original as it scans them. And you ask the question, is this new thing a copy? Was I moved or was I killed in this? And again, this helps you think about the same problem, that I am not what I think I am. And it causes us to come to many of the same conclusions about the self that the Buddha did, which is why it's this is the Western approach to the Eastern Buddhism, no self, is this transporter. There is a very good comic strip called Existential Comics, and this is from Existential Comics, The Machine. It's Existential Comics episode 1. There's like 500 now. And this is from The Machine. Today was a day more than any other that mankind looked at itself and declared, the future is here. A machine has been invented that could instantly transport objects and even people from one place to another. But of course, one individual looked at that and thought, wait a minute, is this a copy? Or did you just murder the original person and made a copy of them? This is the great genocide of all time, he decides, and he begins to protest, picket, and no one pays attention. They all go into the machine because instant teleportation from one place to another is too good to pass up. And so he's picketing out in front of the teleportation center, trying to tell everyone that this machine actually kills. One day, this protester meets the inventor of the machine, and they have a debate about whether the new person is the same as the old person. And among other things, the debate goes through all the things we've discussed just now. And then the inventor of the machine says, you, and by the way, the other individual is called the man because he is the everyman, somebody, anybody. It could be you, could be me, could be a woman, right? It's just the everyman. That's why they never give him a name in the comic. You are not the atoms in your body, but the pattern of the atoms in your consciousness is an emergent feature of that pattern, not of an particular individual atoms, and it is the pattern which is transferred and maintained in the machine. So you're a pattern. Okay, but the pattern changes through time. We just talked about that. So as this individual goes through his own existential crisis, this is a very long comic strip, and I encourage everybody to go read this, by the way. You can find it if you just search for Existential Comics, The Machine. Everyone should read this. Although I'll skim it, you should read it in full. But as the man goes through different ideas of the self, he has different types of existential crisis, depending on what he thinks the self is. First, he thinks it's the atoms, therefore the machine is making copies. Then he realized that his own atoms are changing over time. It's not the atoms, it's the pattern. But then he notices that the pattern is changing over time. Then he decides, well, maybe it's the continuity of consciousness. But then he realizes that he goes to sleep. And he suddenly convinced himself that every time he goes to sleep, he dies. And when he wakes up in the morning, he's a different person. He just happens to have memories from his past life. That's a reasonable thing to think if you think that the continuity of consciousness is what makes the self. Of course, remember, our answer is going to be the self is a fuzzy label. We get to think about it in all sorts of different ways, and whichever one is useful to us at the moment. But at some level, the self is an illusion. At some level, the self is an emergent phenomenon that we get to define. So if it's the flow of consciousness, I can't sleep because then I will die. This tumbles him full on into an existential crisis. First, he tries hedonism. If I'm going to die in a few hours anyway, I might as well go out and find all the pleasure I can. But when he does that, he makes no money. And his future self, who is born the next day, is poor because he has lost all of his money, and each life gets worse and worse and worse. You'll see a parallel here to Buddhism and reincarnation, don't you? Each rebirth is worse because of the karma that we inherit from our past life. Only in this case, it's each day is a life. And as he inherits worse and worse karma, he becomes more and more poor and more destitute, and his life completely falls apart. You see, existential crises can just destroy you. And so here's lost job due to existential crisis, he says. Eventually, he decides the only solution is suicide. So he stands upon a bridge ready to jump off and contemplates his own death. But if he thinks he dies and is reborn each day, there's a problem that he faces, and that is, if he jumps, he murders his future self. One of the points of the existential crisis is, what is the meaning of life, and is there a purpose? And can that purpose sustain making life worth living? Because if life is not worth living, why do we live it? We can give up. And as he's at the moment of thinking about giving up, he says, I can't do this because I'm not a murderer. I would murder my future self. We talked about me, remember? Am I the same person I used to be? If my past self had chosen suicide, I would not exist. He would have murdered me, and I'm quite happy, thank you very much. And that would have been a harmful thing to do to me, to who I am today. So he decides he can't do that. So what are the alternatives? If we are faced with this, what do we do? Suicide isn't an answer. There's no meaning in life, etc. This leads us to the question, what kind of life shall we live? The question David Hume said can't be answered just by looking at the moving atoms. This brings us to the answer we've already discussed. A certain subset of these moving atoms are conscious, and therefore we are a way for the universe to know itself. From inside of that conscious experience, we have preferences, and those preferences determine how we should live. Mary Oliver, Sean Carroll, and Thich Nhat Hanh all come to very, very similar answers to that question, to what kind of life shall we live, by looking at their own consciousness and their own desires. One of the questions we can ask is whether purpose and morality, at this time we're talking about ethics, right? What kind of life should we live? Is that something that is dictated to us by commandment, or is it something that we ourselves construct, like the rules of a basketball game? One of the critiques of this from the religious side is that if morality is constructed, then it's relative and it has no foundation, right? We need something outside to tell us how to behave. The problem is, if God's commandments are arbitrary, then why should we believe his answers over ours? If they're not arbitrary, and as if he gave the commandments he gave for good reasons, or she gave, whatever your concept of God is, then that means there is a reason that itself exists outside of God himself. Right? So in other words, you can think of it this way. Is what God commands right because he commanded it? Or does God command it because it itself is right? My Mormonism primed me to be able to make this particular leap because in Mormon land, God himself is bound by certain rules and laws that he must follow. And so this idea that there is a natural law order out there that itself dictates certain concepts of morality wasn't foreign to me, and I was able to make this jump. So in other words, if you put God in, morality comes from that which makes us happy and brings about good results. If you take God out, It comes from the same thing. In other words, whether you believe in God, you can find meaning in this way, and you should. I wish believers would find meaning in this way, and I wish non-believers would find meaning in this way, because we can construct morality, and it doesn't make it arbitrary, and it doesn't make it random, and it doesn't mean there isn't scientific questions you can ask about it. Imagine constructing the rules of a basketball game. The three-point line didn't used to exist, but one league added it, and it made the game so much more exciting. The players liked it better, and the fans liked it better, and they started having more people come to their stands, and so all the leagues added the three-point line. You can even use science to ask questions about it, right? Science may not be able to objectively look at the moving atoms and tell you how you should live, but science can say, given that humans like certain things, if we construct society in certain ways, it works better. The people in it are more happy. A totalitarian regime with no freedom tends to make people miserable. A free society tends to make people happy. You can ask that question, and you can do research about it. And you can also have rules for what happens when people want different things. Well, somehow we have to negotiate that without killing each other. Otherwise, we're all unhappy. And so you can ask questions about what's the best way to organize society so we can answer those questions. And suddenly, you can put all that truth, all that meaning back on the table, even though you're living in a naturalistic world, even though maybe you've lost faith in God, maybe you haven't. You can go back and you can start asking those same questions you always did, and you can even use science to try to find the best answer to those questions. Mary Oliver said, "Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" That line is familiar to most of us as Unitarian Universalists. Notice how Mary Oliver is confronting death and using it to find meaning in life. One of the things I used to always say is, if life ends and everyone forgets about it, then life has no meaning because it just ends. The problem with that, I now see, is that if you add an eternity to zero, it's still zero. Eternal life is meaningless unless life itself has value. Men are that they might have joy. And that has to be true whether we live for a little while, or whether we live for a long while, or we live forever. Joy has to be value anyway. And if it is a value anyway, then we can find meaning in life, whether or not we believe in a life after this one. In fact, like Mary Oliver, we can find urgency in this life if it is the one wild and precious and short life that we are given. It adds urgency to our desire to find meaning and to make this life meaningful. And so far from killing meaning, the concept of no eternal life can actually add meaning to our lives. In this way, they've each faced death. Mary Oliver, you see facing death just now. I'm going to go through some quotes from each of them as they did this. This is from Mary Oliver. She says, we did in the reading one from Thich Nhat Hanh already, and Sean Carroll comes to the identical conclusion that Mary Oliver does. So actually what I'm going to do is let Mary Oliver speak for all three of them, but they all come to this same sort of conclusion. Locucius just presents this marvelous and important idea that what we are made of will make something else, which to me is very important. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh said about the cloud. There is no nothingness with these little atoms that all run around. You see, she's talking about the naturalist, the atoms, the quantum field. Too little for us to see, but you put them together and they make something. This is emergence. And that, to me, is a miracle. Where it came from, I don't know, but it's a miracle. And I think it's enough to keep a person afloat. See, this is her solution to her own existential crisis, and it is the identical one that we just presented from Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's in the cloud, and it's the identical one that Sean Carroll produces in his poetic naturalism. So I present this to you not as the answer you must accept, but as an answer that you could use to build whatever you choose to make your life of meaning. Because ultimately, whether there is a God or not, meaning must come from within you, a conscious creature who finds meaning in their lives and their life's work. Let's go back to our man standing. We left him standing upon a bridge, contemplating suicide. He decides he can't commit suicide because that would be committing murder against his future selves. And he also realizes he's already been doing that. Each life adds bad karma to the next, to the next, to the next, and he makes himself miserable. And he starts to live each day. There's a song by Tim McGraw, Live Like You Were Dying. His recognition that each day is a life, and once he sleeps, he dies, makes him live each life like he's dying. But he does it with compassion for the life that will come after. I'm not going to take from my future self. I'm going to go to work today so that my future self will have food to eat. Because I care not just about my life, but about his and about yours. And it makes him compassionate to the people around him. I apologize, I should have switched to this slide before I just said all that. So, he found a job doing farm work in the country, and each day he worked, and each night he sat alone with his thoughts. Many years passed. Each day was the same pleasant cycle. He spoke little to the townsfolk, but when he did, he was always cheerful, patient, and kind. Mostly they wanted little to do with him and regarded him as an old fool, although a few treated him almost like a holy man. This is what happens when you push your way through an existential crisis. This is how the Buddha came out the other side of his. This is how Mary Oliver was born from her abuse and her brush with cancer to create some of the most beautiful poems mankind has ever seen. And remember, beauty is one of those things that comes inside of a conscious creature. What little money he had, he gave away, for he knew he had no claim on it, and no one can possibly deserve the money they have, for it isn't them which earned it, but a past self. Anyone else has an equal right to it. So he gave whatever he could to those who were the poorest, and he knew what it was like to have life poisoned by the foolishness of your past. Eventually, he grew old and sick and was told that he would die. When given the news, he simply smiled and thanked the doctor. Are you sure you understand what I'm saying? He died 1,000 deaths. He feared not one more. He felt only the pang of sadness, that his memories would not be passed on. Mostly, however, he reflected happily on the thoughts of himself and his past lives, and he thought his moment of life was perhaps the greatest of them all. Although he had endured the pain of his illness, as the last man, he had the memory of all his previous selves, whereas each of them would never know the thoughts of those who came after themselves. And so he passed peacefully into the void for the last time. Religion has proposed many answers to the purpose of life. Mormonism had one, Buddhism had another, and poetic naturalism has its own. But for me, compassion for those around me and the recognition that I am not alone, I am part of a greater whole, part of the universe, is the core of my own sense of purpose. It is said that the Buddha touched the ground while sitting under the Bodhi tree and contemplated the nature of his self. And as he thought about the nature of himself, he was able to overcome suffering. And that's, of course, my hope, that we can find peace and acceptance with our own mortality, with death, maybe even the death of our loved ones, our own death, and our own suffering, as we contemplate the nature of the self, with answers from science, religion, and poetry. One more from religion. This one's from Carl Sagan. We are a way for the universe to know itself. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return, and we can because the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff. You'll see how poetic naturalism is inherent in the words that he says. And a final thought from Mary Oliver. I have no answers, but only some suggestions. I offer today what I've shared as a suggestion, not an answer. I know that a life is much richer with a spiritual part to it, whatever that looks like to you. And I think nothing is more interesting than the discussions of who we are, where we came from, and why we're here. if joy could give purpose to the plan of salvation as laid out in a Mormon paradigm, it can also give meaning and purpose to this moment right now, with me, with you, and the next, and the next, and the one after that, until we build a life of meaning and purpose and a gift to ourselves and to others. Whether I'm a Mormon, whether I'm a Unitarian Universalist, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a theist, I hope we can find that meaning together. If you would like to know more, here are some suggestions. This one, Mary Oliver has obviously many books you can read of her poetry, but I was especially moved by the interview she gave with On Being by Krista Tippett. There's a transcript available on that link. If you're watching online, when I get home, I'll put in the comments that link so you can click on it and write it down. Or I can email it to people. If anyone here wants it, send me an email. Sean Carroll, the book is The Big Picture. I highly recommend it. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book, No Death, No Fear. All of them touch on this same sort of idea. And if you'd like to read those, you can. I recommend them. Like I said, this podcast is not long, and the transcript will only take you a few minutes to read, and it's very, very moving by Mary Oliver. The other thing I would recommend is go read the Existential comic. I love that story. It's very moving to me, and it really touches on how I've built my own sense of meaning and purpose. And so I highly recommend that. This is also the link to The Machine. But if you Google Existential Comics, The Machine, you will find it. It should be the first hit. Thank you. Let us be together in silence.
Thank you, James. Before we go, I have a few announcements. The first is our annual meeting will take place soon after the service on Sunday, May 22nd. Annual reports and ballots will arrive in the mail soon, so please watch your mail and the announcements email list for details. Today is also the deadline to return your pledge form for the next year. If you have it with you this morning, please leave it with the board members. Members, are you here? Please raise your hands. There they are. Look, and they can grab those. Blank forms are also available today if you need one. Again, please ask our board members. So if you're looking to make a gift for the first time, if you're not ready today, please return the form to the church as soon as you're able this week, and we thank you for your continued generosity. Finally, Reverend John's 15th anniversary with the church is this week, and there will be a celebration of this next Sunday after the service. So please join us at 11:30 in the fellowship hall to celebrate that. And then finally, I would like to invite Kokyong McNaughton to come up for an important Canvas announcement.
Good morning. My name is Kokyong McNaughton, and I have a confession to make. And now here's my confession. I have a phobia about public speaking. But what better time to confront my phobia than on today, my 73rd birthday? Step outside your comfort zone, they say. So here I am. I was born and raised in tropical Malaysia. I have lived in London for 3 years, California, Davis, another 3, and the rest of my life here in Los Alamos. I came to Los Alamos in 1976 with a toddler in tow. I joined the Newcomers Club, and since they didn't have any play group, and I needed one for Jenni, I started one. I also started teaching Tai Chi through the YMCA and Chinese cooking classes from my home. Through these activities, I met many Unitarians. So when I expressed my curiosity about the Unitarian Church, one young woman, a mother in our play group, simply called up the church and put me on the Voice mailing list. I read the Voice for several months before I set foot in this church. It was during the first sermon I attended. It was during the time of Dale Arnick's search. And so I know about what was going on during that time of our history. The first sermon, it was a Sunday for guests that I attended, was a program given by Amnesty International. After the service, people sat around on the tables and wrote postcards to free political prisoners around the world. So once I started attending church, I was delighted to find the extended family program in full swing. It was just what I needed. I didn't know much about UU theologies then, but I made many friends, and it was these lasting friendships that made me stay. I've been a member since 1976, longer than many of you here have been around. Throughout these 47 years, I have served our church in many ways: hospitality chair, membership chair, adult and children's RE teacher, youth leader, youth choir director, about your sexuality classes, voice editor, General Assembly delegate, event organizers, and president, and most recently, grounds chair. It was during my year as the president of this church that we lost our church administrative assistant to a higher paying job. I was at a crossroad between jobs and was spending so much of my time doing church work that I decided to apply for the position. It was a very tricky path to navigate between being an employee of the church and being its president. I was my own boss. I walked a fine line between being a volunteer on the one hand and being an employee on the other. And it was from the vantage point of being the church administrative assistant that opened my eyes to the larger UU world outside our church. I began getting involved with the global UU community, going to general assemblies, meeting other UUs of color, and getting really fired up about our denomination. I served on the UUA's first electronic communications committee for 6 years, and we launched the first UUA website and listserv, hosted by one of our service providers. I then served on the UUA's nominating committee for another 6 years, 2 of which as its chair. I'm a founding member of the Asian Pacific Islander UU Caucus of Drum, which stands for Diverse and Revolutionary UU Multicultural Ministries, and served on its steering committee and newsletter editor for several years. I was on the advisory panel for the development of the UUA's anti-racist multicultural curriculum called Building the World We Dream About. Mike and I both volunteer as Webb reporters for every General Assembly for more than 10 years until we no longer were needed as events began to be recorded and live streamed. So no other denomination would accept me as I am, without my having to check my beliefs at the door. With my upbringing of a mix of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and ancestral worship, I fitted right in. Even my traditional cultural upbringing found support in this church. A case in point. In Malaysia, babies slept in hammocks suspended from the ceiling. made from sarongs that wrapped around them like cocoons. The up-down motion of the hammock attached to the spring easily allowed them to sleep. I was able to fashion such a hammock in the nursery. I was able to fashion such a hammock in the nursery when I brought my baby to church. Nobody objected to me drilling a hole in the ceiling. My theology is a fusion of the best practices from both my Chinese tradition and UU theologies. Rather than rejecting my past, UU helps me build upon my past. With the support from my church friends and church leadership, my church is a springboard for me to fully realize my passion and leap forward into serving the larger community. Such passions as hate crime legislations, on diversity, anti-racism, ethical eating, accessibility, sustainable gardening advocacy, music, spiritual practices, and others. What are your passions, and how can we help? My commitment to this church and to our faith have gone through many tests of fires and heartbreaks. I assure you that it has not always been a bowl of cherries. Even as recently as last week, I felt sick to my stomach at something someone has done. I have been hurt by some people's words and actions, just as my words and actions have wounded others that without my knowledge. I have been disappointed by others, just as I have disappointed some. I joined this church when I was 26. I brought up both children here. My daughters were married here. My grandchildren are growing up here. All of them have participated in children's choir, some in our whole lives, and all in RE classes and other activities according to their needs as they evolve. They may not come to church often, but they embrace our teaching and philosophies outside of these walls. I pledge, because I want to keep this wall open to everyone who needs us, and I hope you do too.
Thank you, Ko-kyung, and thank you, James. I have the space for the choir so nobody trips over a cable. For our offertory, today, this is an opportunity to share some of what we have with the wider world. And our partner for this month of April is for the western region of the UUA and the youth summer camps. 100% of all our givings today will be to there. We will pass the baskets around, but we also have a box at the back if you wish to use that as instead. And we also have the Givelify app. Simply download that onto your phone and select the Unitarian Church as your gift partner. May the offertory music lift your spirits, and may what you give bring you joy.
Friends, may life bless us and keep us. The light of life shine upon us and out from within us. Be gracious to us and bring us and the world peace. For this is the day. This is the one wild and precious life that we are given. So let us all find a way to rejoice and be glad in it. Go in peace.